Welcome everyone as we commence the new year with the combined Adria FOAJ luncheons. Welcome to the January session. We're looking forward to hearing from our speakers shortly. Adria and the FOAJ have been, for the best part, sponsoring these luncheons on a monthly basis. So we encourage you to subscribe to the free newsletters or check our website on a regular basis, or check our regular emails and make sure you sign up as new webinars are announced. We typically record them. Many of the recordings for past luncheons are featured on the luncheon website at Adria, and I believe the FOAJ has them available as well. So for those of you that are looking for extra professional development time or CEE points, those can be viewed, past sessions can be viewed as well. As far as the topics and speakers go, we're always open to suggestions. There is a luncheon committee that meets several times a year to sort of chart out potential speakers and potential topics. So we're very interested in your suggestions. Perhaps you've seen a quality speaker in the past that would speak to issues that of relevance to these two communities. And we invite you certainly to send those suggestions in to info@adralberta.com, as the slide indicates. So let me tell you a little bit about the two organizations. I'll start with Adria. So Adria is the ADR Institute of Alberta. That's the professional association for mediators and arbitrators and other dispute resolution professionals in this province. We're part of a network of provincial and regional affiliates across the country underneath ADR Canada. And we offer a variety of ADR training and ADR services to the public and to the business community. I invite you to check out our website. It's featured on the slide. You'll find an online directory there, for example, of ADR professionals, mediators, and arbitrators. You can sign up for a free newsletter, and there's a training catalog there for a variety of communications and ADR courses, communications, mediation, arbitration. And there's an open registration option for some public training courses that we're now offering. Most of our courses are now offered online and in the classroom. And of course, private training contracts can be arranged as well if your organization is interested in that. So I invite you to visit the website, kick the tires, get to know us a little bit. And we believe in offering ADR as a preferred option to courts and litigation. So, and at that point, I will invite Karen to tell you a little bit about the Foundation of Administrative Justice.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome back, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Karen Popoff. I'm one of the executive directors for the Foundation of Administrative Justice. The foundation is much like Adria. We call it the FOAJ sometimes as well. So we're much like Adria. We provide professional development for people in the industry. So the industry includes people who work for agencies, boards, commissions, people who are making decisions on other people's lives. We hold a certificate program. It's the Certificate in Tribunal Administrative Justice. So some of our courses that lend itself to that program is decision writing, decision making, effective hearings, and case management practices. So some of you might be interested in some of that. We also are working and working towards having other webinars and other lunch and learn. So if you're not interested in a full program, we have that, and you can also just take one of our courses if that's the one that speaks mostly to you. Our calendar is up on our website, so if you want to have a look at that, it's foaj.ca. And we welcome you to look at our website as well. And I hope you enjoy the presentation today. Thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Karen. As the slide would indicate, we will, Graham will give 30, 40-minute presentation, probably more towards the 30-minute mark. And then we will be open for a moderated Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, you will find a Q&A function, but more importantly, the chat function. I do find it easier just to scroll through the chats and try to combine questions of interest and moderate in that fashion. So I invite you to familiarize yourself with those options. And then I think it's also important that we recognize the land that we're meeting on, or the virtual environment that we're meeting in. So today we do meet virtually, but certainly as individuals, we participate on lands previously occupied by our Indigenous peoples. We're encouraged to remember their heritage and history, as well as the important contributions of many races and cultures in our shared history of settlement and immigration in Canada. Let us begin then by acknowledging that for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have walked these territories, weaving their identity and spirituality intimately with the land. We acknowledge with respect that we live, work, and play on lands that are often delineated by treaty or otherwise occupied by settlers. Keep us mindful of the many covenants and treaties that we have made and often broken with our Indigenous peoples. Knowing that they have suffered, may we find new ways to live with respect on this land, moving into reconciliation as we journey forward together. Thank you. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Graham Singh. So Graham is a graduate of the London School of Economics. He is an Anglican minister. He's a researcher, and fundamental to our talk today, he's the founding CEO of Trinity Centers Foundation in Montreal. It's a new national charity that looks to preserving our historic church architecture and even some urban architecture, and they favor a model that looks towards community hubs, and he'll tell you more about that. Graham picked up much of his experience in the UK. He lived in London for over a decade, and of course, you know, England is full of churches and many opportunities and experiences to repurpose them for the benefit of the community. Graham is a native of Guelph. He now lives in Montreal, as mentioned, with his wife and 3 children. He leads St. Jack's Church, renamed as St. Jack's, a historic church in downtown Montreal, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that. Trinity Centers Foundations itself offers strategic consulting support to dozens of land-owning congregations across Canada. And he's currently working with a project in Edmonton and a project in Calgary. So he's published, he's a thought leader in the area of environmental, social, and corporate governance. And just the nature of his work would suggest that he has learned a lot as a layman, if you will, about dispute resolution. It's not easy to bring together different faiths into a common building. I know this from my own experiences with the military when we had to combine Protestant and Roman Catholic chapels into one. I was actually surprised at how many conflicts arise just from that what seemingly simple discussion amongst Christian partners. Certainly Graham's work and his talk will focus on church architecture, but also on urban architecture. And, you know, how do you bring together congregations, business interests, nonprofits, and you know, as you'll see, some groups that are, you know, markedly different in their purpose and their intent than perhaps a church might have been. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Graham, and he will lead us through I hope a very interesting discussion of dispute resolution in a very interesting setting. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is a privilege to be with you, and I come here as somebody who finds myself in all kinds of difficult situations, and so thankful for professionals who know how to get us out of them. So thank you for the work you're doing, and it really is a privilege to try to share something of what we've seen in a way that may help you in the contexts where you are. And what a week we've had, right? Many celebrations at some disputes resolved south of our borders. But of course, for Albertans, very difficult news about Keystone XL. In the context of those various things happening, I bring you greetings from your sisters and brothers in Quebec. We love you, Albertans, very much. And you know, our hearts break as the weight of the pandemic continues to weigh upon us all in different ways. The purpose of my talk today is to bring you some insight, some hopefully inspiration, some reflection from the world that I inhabit, where we're trying to figure out what to do with all of Canada's empty church buildings. And I can tell you the ways that churches do conflict uh, are very, very special. There's a little way, they're special. And as a specialist in working with closed churches, many of which have been closed for child protection reasons, I can tell you, I've learned about disputes the hard way. But to give you a bit of a smile and make sure we're starting on the same wavelength, I want to show you inside one of the life of one of our newer partners in this work, which is in fact one of Montreal's newest circus companies. And as you watch this video, I want you to be asking yourself, as a dispute resolution professional, imagine showing this video to a bishop who's considering handing over one of their buildings to our community hub model. Let's have a look at that for a moment now.
Emportés par la foule qui nous traîne, nous entraîne, écrasés l'un contre l'autre, nous ne formons qu'un seul corps. Et le flot sans effort nous pousse enchaîner l'un et l'autre, et nous laisse tous deux épanouis, enivrés et heureux. Entraînés par la foule qui s'élance et qui danse, une folle farandole, nos deux mains restent soudées. Et parfois soulevés, nos deux corps enlacés s'envolent, et retombent tous deux épanouis, enivrés et heureux.
I hope you enjoyed that. And when you first heard we were talking about churches, perhaps you had a different picture in mind than some of that. And you know, with the circus company as one example, we told them when they first started, we said, you know, you can go anywhere in the church except the kind of the front part where the communion table is. We'd like to keep that for church activity. We hadn't mentioned to them that we really didn't want them to use the pulpit. And actually the DJ, who's called DJ Michel, he very quickly realized that a pulpit makes a very fine place for a DJ. And so we had to go back and decide whether that was going to be a conflict. In the end, we let DJ Michel take up shop, you know, set up shop in the pulpit. And we found that the hundreds and now thousands of younger people who come through that church building, of course, are more interested in the pulpit because of him than because of us. We also have two dispute resolution protocols in addition to our leasing and co-licensing of the building, which is pretty complicated. We have over 50 organizations who share that space, and that's part of our vision for how this may roll out across Canada. We have about a dozen sites we're working on around Canada, including, as Paul mentioned, projects in Calgary, including at McDougall United, which is one of the oldest, most famous heritage buildings in Edmonton, and beautiful 4-acre site in Calgary, which is not a heritage site, and not exactly community hub there. But going back to those protocols, you know, one is on nudity and the other is on evil. Now, did you ever think that people sharing churches would be bothered about nudity? Maybe you could say, well, they should have been worried about that for quite some time. But we're learning and saying actually what it means to be an artist in the circus and what you wear is very different from the way that a charity working with refugees might see it. The way in which a Shakespeare play might present a version of evil vis-a-vis what a preacher might preach in their sermon, of course, needs space. We need to give way to each other. And this is a process we call partial temporary deconsecration. This is a time where we take our potential disputes, we realize that they become sacred. We actually talk about holy ground representing some of these beliefs and the need to deconsecrate space in order to allow someone else to reconsecrate, or indeed our aim to see spaces co-consecrated. And you as dispute resolution professionals know what it's like when someone has come to believe what they believe so strongly that it becomes like an idol, like something they'd worship, they'd sacrifice their children to. And of course, in the church, and when we talk about things like church pews, we get all kinds of issues that need careful thought. And as I said earlier, and I'll probably say a few other times in between, we've caused more problems than we've solved. But I have to say, what we're doing is trying to underline problems that are already there. And I believe now is a time for some of them to come out. So my role in dispute resolution is often someone in that kind of a situation, and I have much more to learn than to teach. But I will share with you some of my lessons from, let's call it the School of Hard Knocks. Bit of background: I grew up in Ontario. My parents, my father and my grandfather were both chiefs of the medical staff at the hospital in Guelph. They're both presidents of the Rotary Club. My grandmother kick-started the first school for mentally disabled boys, as it was then, and were involved in starting the Friends of Schizophrenia for the province of Ontario. That's the kind of context I grew up in. And I then went on to study politics, and then eventually, as Paul said, diplomacy at the London School of Economics, where I was the fourth person in the world to access both the British and American intelligence service documents regarding a fairly well-organized coup in my father's home country, which was, involving trade union representatives dressed up, spies dressed up as trade union representatives. So, I mean, it's a bit of a mixed background, folks. That's what I'm really trying to say. And so you wonder, well, how on earth did I end up ordained as an Anglican priest at St. Paul's Cathedral, and then working in advertising? Well, that's my story, and I'm happily tell you more another time. But it's from that background that I became part of a team in England, in our denomination there called the Church of England, which is where the Anglican Church comes from, where we saw over 100 closed churches reopened. And this began the true work of diplomacy in my life. I'll tell you the story of Doreen. Doreen came to me on one of those projects fairly early. She's in her 80s, and she said, I don't like your style of worship. I don't like your music, and I'm not really sure I like you. But if what you're doing is going to bring the children in to this church, which has been empty for decades, then I'm for whatever you're doing, and I'm for you. And one of the things she loved the most was a song that we wrote called, the song that we sang called "Are You Ready, Ready, Ready? Ring a ding a ding a ding," and that you ring the bells of the church. Doreen would sing this with the children. But 6 months after the project began, she was on her deathbed, and she couldn't speak. She was intubated, and all she could do was make the signs, saying, "I'm ready." She had seen her church that she loved in the way that she loved it changed. She went through the change, and she lived to see the other side, and she died with peace in her heart. Very often I'm asked by churches who say, well, why don't you just leave the older folks alone? Let's not talk to them about all this right now. And I often respond, I say, is that actually the best way to love the older folks in this congregation? To hide the truth from them, or to tell them the truth so that they can engage it? And perhaps, like Doreen, see the day when things were turned around. This all led to my feeling called, along with my wife, Celine, to come back to Canada. After it was 14 years in total, we were in the UK. And I came back and I began digging around a little bit in what was happening here in Canada. We'd been invited back by a church who'd bought a closed church building, and they'd asked for our help. The bishops gave us permission to come. And as we began to look around what was happening, it was about 6 weeks after I was back in Canada, I was invited to a United Church of Canada conference. And I wanted to attend the conference and hear what they were learning, but they said that they wanted me to be a speaker. And they said, what would you like to learn about? I said, well, you should really be talking about hard conversations, And they said, well, great, you'll do the seminar on hard conversations. I said, no, I don't know how to do the seminar. But they said, no, we don't. It's you. You're going to have to figure it out. And actually, I put together an answer for that seminar, which I still use today. And I wanted to share with you, I'm sure many of your courses and wonderful things you're doing are far more interesting and complicated, but this has worked for us on the ground. And it comes in the context, and by the way, one of the other speakers at that conference, he said this about the institution that we were working within, the established colonial churches of Canada, okay? This theologian and researcher, George Hunter III, he said this: "We have observed," he wrote, "in the last half century, an endless line of proposals and plans for reviving or renewing or revitalizing the nation's tired old denominations. Over 100 published proposals for the renewal, in his case, of American Methodism alone. To my knowledge, however, no one has yet succeeded in turning around a declining denomination." We'll come back to this issue of institutions that need to live and those that we need to let close. But those points that I came up with then, I want to share with you now. Put them up on the screen here. And in my context, in challenging parishes, this is what we try to do. We try to explain what's happening in a hard situation. Very often, explaining the truth is an art form that I'm sure many of you have developed. Explaining the truth to congregations that are closing is this particular challenge. I then always take more time than maybe necessary to invite those into a situation of conflict resolution. Often this means there's a church board, but not everyone on that church board wants to be involved in resolving that particular conflict. The invitation then allows those who don't want to be there to step away. And we're dealing with one situation right now where I look back and wish we had done that even more than we could have. As a Christian myself and working with many different faith groups, but most of them I would say are Christians, the opportunity to pray is so important, to pray for each other. I've been learning from, in fact, the Unitarians, who are not a Christian organization. They're a kind of they have a very great respect for multiple faith views. Their own understanding of prayer has helped me learn from them. Then recognizing particularly anxiety, defensiveness, and aggression where it comes up. And I have to say, in church conflicts, it comes up incredibly quickly and represents a huge amount of our work for the Trinity Centers Foundation. Then the good old-fashioned classics of playing back feelings, not opinions, and indeed playing back what you've heard. Discussing that which has been observed. And then in the case of churches closing, preferring honesty over agreement has taken up a huge amount of our time. Often just taking time to get the honesty of where are we really, which may come in the context of saying, how do your grandchildren perceive how your church is doing? That's a great one. These very simple tools have been useful for us. Since that time, and since those times, and I would say most of my time is spent in those kinds of situations, parish by parish, dealing with congregations that perhaps steward a heritage building, often a building like McDougall at the heart of a city, where the whole city is looking to that building, not only for what happens with the heritage of the building, but what does that mean for the Christian faith, for instance? And what does that mean for charities? And how are we going to make sense of the future? What's the story around decolonization, for instance, which I've been writing about a fair bit lately? We realized we needed to set up a new entity. And that's why we set up the Trinity Centers Foundation. We realized that setting up a secular entity was going to help us get around some of the classic conflicts, which we can talk more about in the chat. And by the way, I know Paul's mentioned on there, feel free to be putting questions into the chat even now as I'm speaking. It's not by any ways rude to interrupt by chatting or throwing those questions in there. I'm not reading them till the end, till the chat, but please put them in there. One of the ways we've gotten around, let me call them some of the classic conflicts between more liberal and more conservative denominations has been to create a secular charity and say that the community hubs need to play by society's rules. That applies, for instance, on questions around human sexuality, on who gets to be involved in governance, that we absolutely need to play by society's rules. We may not, however, need to have every congregation that meets in a building agree on every part of their religious doctrine. So we have more liberal churches in the morning and more conservatives in the afternoon, or vice versa. And we think that by creating a secular community hub platform, we create an environment where some of those conflicts are resolved more easily. We then set about trying to figure out how we steward these assets. I mentioned decolonization. Those are some of the deep justice issues of the tax exemptions that churches are given. And I'll give you another example of the kind of conflicts that we get into. We had a call from one major Canadian city. In fact, I can say who it is because it's all been in the news now, from Quebec City. We had calls from the Roman Catholic Archdiocese as well as calls from the municipality, both saying, hey, could you help us look at this? We're not quite hearing each other well. And of course, the municipality, the church said, we need the municipality to understand canon law. And the municipality said, well, we need the church to understand the law. And this issue of solving conflicts where there are multiple jurisdictions of authority is something that I'm sure many of you are very experienced in. When it comes to the church, just simply that difference between secular society that has expectations, for instance, about all kinds of ethical positions, as well as religious communities, as well as municipal urbanistic frameworks. This is the environment that, you think of an old church sitting on a street corner. In fact, these are the environments of heritage protection, the engineering structures and regulations around the building, charitable accountancy governance. Now we're really into a multi-jurisdiction. So when somebody says, this is the way it's always been done, or this is the way it ought to be done, they might be referring at one point to 7 or 8 different regulatory frameworks. And this is a huge cause for the kinds of conflicts that we hopefully are stepping into with some solutions. I must say the most classic conflict we come into is can we get those church pews out? I sometimes joke saying we have teams available to send in to remove pews in the dark of night if we get a kind of wink and a nudge from a chairperson of a church board saying, just get those pews out. And sometimes, I'm not even exaggerating really. Sometimes that's the best way to deal with the conflict, when everybody knows the pews, for heaven's sake, will have to come out if we want others to come in and use them. Yet those classic conflicts, again, they come up again and again and again. Within this context, I wanted to offer to you 4 themes that we've observed and that I believe may come up for you. I'm going to share those 4 themes with you and then talk a little bit about them. I believe in this coming season, and certainly from our work in seeing institutions that are closing, and like the quote I mentioned from George Hunter III, over 100 proposals to see even just one church denomination renewed, he doesn't actually have faith in. He has faith in the people of the church, faith in the message of the Christian faith, but not necessarily that institution. What are other institutions that you may, as a dispute resolution professional, you may have assumed going into a particular dispute that everybody hopes that the institutions they came in with are going to be there when they leave? I think that's changing. I think COVID, I think what's happened with our sisters and brothers in the United States, which we see echoes of in the church, and we see echoes of as we look at the church in Alberta versus the rest of Canada. Remarkable similarities, by the way, between Alberta and Quebec. We could talk about more in the chat. I think there may be a different expectation of the kinds of institutions that are going to make it, and more of a sense of it's okay actually to let those ones go. Christians talk about powers and principalities. You may have heard of this in the Bible, and those would be defined as a created thing that comes to control us. A created thing that controls us in a right way might be an institution that's well set up. But a created thing that controls us in a way which is no longer tenable may be the signs of an institution that's on its way out. And as an Anglican priest, I can tell you that there's a great deal of love within the church. But there's also a very great awareness that the institutions that many of us represent have come to their natural end. Second is more contexts will clash. We had a group at a prayer meeting of Iranian and Chinese Christians praying for the world around us. You know what they prayed for? They prayed that God would set us free from the algorithms of the social media. And as I look at what's happened in the US, and I'm sure you do as well, you realize, what if the algorithms of our social media are polarizing us even more than the choices that we make in our own social media selections? I mean, this is a very serious point, but the contexts that those algorithms create for us, I believe, are actually stretching away. They're moving further and further apart. And I believe we will see more and more contexts clashing for reasons like the social media context that we exist in. PTSD is something very serious. Paul mentioned his own military background. I think there is a PTSD from war, post-traumatic stress disorder, from war, from abuse, things that many of you may know a great deal about. I do believe that the trauma of this period in history is going to have a huge impact on the way that we resolve conflicts. And the sense of disorientation, and again, I make no apologies for sharing my perspective, yes, as a leader of a secular charity, but also a Christian pastor. One of the huge themes in the Old Testament is that of orientation and disorientation, and then reorientation again. And at this time where society has been given the burden of disorientation, but also the great gift of disorientation, if we looked at it from the lens of many faith groups, what could the gift of this disorientation do to solve conflicts where perhaps people weren't even willing to see how much they need them? And that leads me to the final theme that I'd love for us to discuss more. And let me put it this way. For my grandparents, they lived through world wars. My parents then looked at the aftermath of those wars and began, both my parents eventually being in North America. My father grew up in South America, in British Guyana, but a Western context. The time between the boomers and now, I think, has had a good 25 or 30 years where I'm not sure people really understood the need for changing anything. I think many people just thought, the world's basically okay. We'll be fine. We're fairly well off. We can tweak a few things here and there, but there's not really a desperate need for systemic change. Now, of course, that's a ridiculous thing to say to somebody living in sub-Saharan Africa or somebody who's the victim of some other atrocity of war or otherwise. But I want to say there's a huge part of Western culture which was very, very comfortable. What does it mean for us to have lived through this or be living through this pandemic? Is it the case that many of the things that people were shouting about needing to be important, our care for the environment, our care for racial justice, the questions of economic justice, as we look and we've lived almost in a situation of universal basic income. What does this mean for our desire for a deep, structured peace and restructuring of society? And how many of the disputes that you enter into, in fact, are reflecting some of that deeper change? What if a desire for peace, a desire for the real resolution of disputes has heightened? Isn't it the case that Canadians and the world are looking for those kinds of resolutions more and more? So we have a few other things we wanted to share with you between Paul and I. Want to leave some space for that to come out in some of the chat. I'm going to invite Paul to come back and join me, and we have lots more things to talk about. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. How does the context of churches closing and changing and trying to become community hubs reflect upon your practice as a dispute resolution professional? We're over to discussion. Over to you, Paul.
Well, that was great, Graham. And this is the second time we've had an opportunity to do a webinar together. Slightly, common elements, but absolutely a different audience and different themes. So I once again, I've enjoyed it. Thank you. And I look forward to the next 20 minutes or so. I think it's probably fair to say that I find your thoughts on disputes and conflict and structure, there's optimism there, but it's also a little bit sobering. I think it's, if anything about the experience of the last year or the last 4 years, sometimes in some cases has taught us, is that our structures are prone to conflicts that perhaps we didn't expect. And I know the U.S. experience, they're going to be learning a lot from.
Oh, I think you just accidentally hit mute, Paul. Just the last few seconds. There we go.
Not sure how I did that, but
there you go. You're back on.
I was starting to say I know the U.S. experience is going to give them a lot to think about in the years ahead, and I think there are, and we're not going to talk about that, but certainly that desire to find a structured peace is and finding unity where there is disunity is going to be a very central theme south of the border. I'm going to start off with maybe a personal question. You've been doing this for a while, in the UK
Yeah.
and now in Canada, and I can't tell you how thrilled, certainly the institution here in McDougall Church here in Edmonton was to learn of your expertise in this area and what you can offer. But what have you learned about yourself during all this exposure to conflict and the pressure on you to resolve conflict? I'm curious
Wow.
what you've learned or perhaps even changed about yourself.
One of the things that one of our bishops told us before you go out planting new churches, the first thing you need to do is get a marriage counselor. And my wife and I have always stuck with that and realized that when you're out trying to help others, you've got to watch out for relationships at home and take special care. And I thank God for my wife. We thanks to that discipline in some ways of having folks around us. I have a personal coach and spiritual director that I meet with once a month. I think those of us, and of course many of you who may come from a pure counseling background, that's just a matter of course, that of course you've got supervisors who are watching out for you. But I've learned about myself how much I need that. And when I think about classic marriage course material of knowing whether you're more like a rhino or more like a hedgehog, I am 50% rhino, 50% hedgehog. Do you guys know that concept, by the way? So the idea of when you come into conflict, you're more like a rhinoceros that puts their horns down and charges at the other person? Or are you more like a hedgehog that when conflict comes, you roll up into a little ball and stick out your spikes? Learning about myself, knowing that when does the hedgehog come out, and having team members around who complement that, I realized, I'm not a conflict avoider. I'm a conflict engager. And I want to say I'm learning more and more about my own weaknesses. You and I know, Paul, we talked a little bit about it, but we have a situation right now where there's a person who has a very different view on automatic weapons. That's come into part of our work, and we didn't have a policy on automatic weapons, and I've been very firm about it. I have no problem with automatic weapons being used by military forces. I do have some concerns about where they mix with churches, and I have been bristling in that situation, and I've learned about myself that I'm not immune. As somebody who gets into this, I need a lot of help, maybe more help than I did before.
That's and I think that opportunity to look at yourself is very valuable. And I know it's something that the audience does on a daily basis as they deal with conflict and whether they're managing emotions for their own benefit or for the benefit of the parties. So that's always a tough question. One of the questions that was raised by an attendee was, beyond just the fact that you're often trying to create a community hub, your community hubs actually exist in a neighborhood, and
Yes.
and what have your experiences been in terms of dealing with the neighbors of the center and their reaction to increased usage or the like? I'm sure you've seen some conflict situations arise there too.
We have. I mean, we had a homeless shelter that closed quite soon after my arriving, and you try to mix talking about regulatory frameworks, you try to mix the desires of a homeless shelter with a safe church policy of a church trying to protect younger and older people, and you immediately realize that this is not easy. Homeless ministry and homeless action, for instance, in a city is one of those things in Canada that's incredibly hard to manage. And the NIMBY effect of not in my backyard is a very, very strong response. And these are very real tensions. You have folks who will be very much against gentrification, and then others who will complain the streets are dirty, and they're kind of wondering how the two go together. So those in an urbanistic context of all of our projects, those conversations are going on all the time. One of the things that we found helpful is to realize, and actually I'm behind me is pictured a conference by one of our local universities, Concordia University. What we found is that these places are very, very natural places to convene difficult discussions. So we invite every political party to come and run their events here, the debates, the presentations of municipal plans, and that's part of one of the things we have in mind for McDougall, is just to open up, for instance, and get more of those discussions happening, so that we're known rather as a place that puts forward one opinion, for instance, on the Christian faith, to be known rather as a place where people with multiple views can come, express themselves, and debate. And this is something we're talking about, really restating what a steeple means in a city. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the person's question, but there's certainly some discussion around our neighbors.
No, it's priceless. Thank you. One commenter said we need more Doreens, and
I saw that. That was beautiful.
I thought that comment was good too.
I agree.
And you referred to the elderly population that often occupies a lot of airspace, an important airspace within our historic congregations. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about the importance of inclusion. I know it was one of your points, but inclusive conversations and not cutting someone out of the conversation. How important has that been to your work?
Oh boy, I'll tell you one story to illustrate that one. I got a call once, fairly early on in this work, fairly early in my time back from Canada, from a bishop. I won't say where, but he called and he said, "Please, will you fly to my city, and I'll tell you what I need when you get here." So I went there, and he said, "Okay, we're going to see this church, and they're trying to connect with this other church, and they're not hearing each other. And so please, could you just go and talk to them? But what you think you should do, just make sure you do it and don't hold back." And I said, "Well, what do you mean, Bishop? I mean, I'll just follow your lead." And he said, "Well, no," he said, "I'm not going to the meeting." he said, you're in, right? And he said, "Watch out for this old boy." And he gave me the description of this guy who was just awful person in the way he was behaving towards others. And sure enough, we got into this discussion and we talked about sharing the space with refugee groups and arts groups and all the rest of it. And he stood up and he said, "Over my dead body, will those pews come out?" And I thought to myself, I'm never going to be invited back to this city again. So the only thing I have to go by is the bishop told me not to hold back. So I said, "Well, is that true, what you've said? And is it right? Should we wait? We're all trying to have this discussion and listen to what should be done. But is it right that we should wait for you to die to make the right decision? Or should we try to make the decision as best we can now?" And in a sense, maybe there was a much better, I'm sure there are people on this call who coach me how to do much better in that situation. But in some ways, that person was a bully who'd been bullying everybody there. And the only reason I was there was to take a hit from the bully and stand up to him. And then I left. And in fact, they didn't do what the bishop wanted them to do. And they're still languishing there in that particular place. I think sometimes, I don't mean for it to be exclusion, but I do think some of these things need to be called out. And I'll tell you, the bullying that happens when church groups get together to talk about the end of an institution, it's awful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only imagine. I just want, I imagine, and you alluded to this, that you have had to have some of those really, really tough conversations, perhaps with, I don't want to unjustly characterize anyone, but, people who have been in leadership roles for perhaps a little too long. Maybe they're a little bit past their best before date and they haven't kept up to speed. And sometimes the individual can be the barrier to, and I think that's what you were suggesting.
That's right.
So an important decision, that important decision could be closure. How do you, and I think you've given a good example of how you might get past that. Any other examples that you might share?
I mean, another example of the 100 or so churches that were part of the closed churches team work that we were involved with in England. And when I say 100 churches, I was not involved myself in all 100, so I can't speak for all of them, but I can tell you that there's a good portion of them where actually the project costs involved retiring somebody who was leading there. And if you look at it from any other corporate dispute, there are times where you need to retire a difficult chief executive, pay the guy or gal out fairly because they've not gone against their contract. They're doing what they were contracted to do. The organization's just changed. And so there have been times where folks have been paid out to leave. I mean, there are times with congregations that don't want to go where we've been negotiating saying, isn't it the case that you'd rather have a prayer meeting that's run exactly the way you want it, with the songs sung the way you want them sung, right? With the service book the way you like it, until the day you die. And on the day you die, that's the way you want it all done too. Well, what if we promise to bring an older pastor to come and look after you for that part, and it will never change? And in fact, if we ever bring a younger person to that context, we'll train them on how to do it the old-fashioned way, and they won't even think about doing it the new way. It's going to be done that way until the day you die, and on the day you die, it'll be done that way as well. Well, if we could promise you that, isn't it the case that you could hand over this building, this 40,000 square foot building, which has got $20 million of repairs? By the way, I'm not using McDougall as an answer because we don't have that kind of obstinacy at McDougall, praise God. But actually, that kind of negotiation has actually yielded some really good fruit. And people are able to say, when we name it, they're able to say, actually, that is what I want. In fact, I want my granddaughter to come to this church. And sometimes we have to say, your granddaughter may never come and worship at this church the way you want, but your granddaughter may have started a charity that's going to change the world, and maybe we can get her to run her offices out of this building. So that kind of negotiation, when we can take the anger out and turn it into deliverables, boy, it's wonderful. It's so wonderful. And the Dorians of this world, just to echo what that person said, they are the ones. I'll tell you one other example. A lady called me into her bedside with her nurse. She was 99 years old. This is here in Montreal. It's a well-known story. And called Miss Whitley. And Miss Whitley had paid, their family had paid for a number of the major renovations of the church over 40 or 50 years. And she called me, and she was breathing through not a ventilator, but she had tubes. It was very difficult for her to speak. And she handed me 40 years of letters she had written to my predecessors, Paul, telling them what a total waste of time she thought what they were doing was. She said, these interminable communion services, nobody wants to come. My kids have left the church. My grandkids have left the church. Stop it. We've got to find another way. And so she handed me this big pack of letters, which she kept copies of. And she has a secretary who carefully, set this up. And she said, I'm not sure about what you're doing, but here were my complaints, and I think that you're answering them. And then she died, and I was a treasure to receive that.
Yes. Yeah. Putting the issues, the hard issues on the table is really important, yeah. Graham. Clearly that's been part of your strategy.
And not everybody dies after the hardest conversations, by the way, but some do.
I've had a few hard conversations myself, and I'm still here, so
yeah.
all is well. Hey, listen, I know you're itching to show us another video, and I'll take that as an opportunity to scan through some of the questions that I'm
sure.
I think this question, and I know the video you're going to show, I think it speaks to unexpected outcomes, unexpected collaborative opportunities that come from some of these unique partnerships that you've crafted. And I think this one speaks to the performing arts in a church setting. So yeah, and so more than just the video, give us some examples of unexpected outcomes.
Yeah. So here's the context. I mean, you look at how do you get a big old church? How are you going to do it? Well, one of the things we worked out is we had a big green space in front of the church in Montreal, and the city, in fact, is looking for green space. And so we said, well, what if we could lease our green space or sell our green space to the city? It's not actually very straightforward on how to do that. You get all kinds of architects and urban planners, and we've met with lots of them and different people in the city, and the political folks and the functionary folks. What do you call them? The bureaucrats in English, les fonctionnaires en français. But what we realized is we needed to break through and get this message across. And circus folks, as part of their circus act, had invented some circus clergy. So we thought, rather than have the real clergy present any messages, what if the circus clergy presented the message about us trying to get the city's investment into our green space? So a very serious urbanistic problem, but we turned it into a bit of fun. So here, Paul and I both thought, this would be kind of fun to show you just a little piece of it. And these are Anglophone people speaking French, so we think that you'll be able to.
We think you'll be able to follow.
We think you'll be able to follow.
Fiat mi inter sidera. Bienvenue au Centre Saint-Jacques. un lieu de culte, mais aussi un hub communautaire.
Un hub?
Hub? Oui, un hub. On accueille plusieurs différents organismes ici.
Oh yes. Par exemple, un centre réfugié.
Une magnifique salle événementielle.
Un centre de création et d'entraînement pour les artistes de cirque. Et bientôt, pour tous. Woo!
I'll pause there to say that it goes on to explain how we're running the center, and then they begin asking for help. So this is where we turned the mayor of Montreal into a patron saint that the circus priests pray to hope for investment in the city. By the way, that video is not yet released, so if somebody from the city of Montreal sees it here first, then that's fine. We're kind of leaking it out. But I guess it's just a way of, I don't mean to make too serious of a point about it, but I suppose when there are conflicts, and if we can find some way to find humor in the middle of it, why not, if it's appropriate? And we've certainly found that that's been helpful where we can.
And so just to clarify, the actors, if you will, they were from the circus and performance and art troupe that used St. Jack's, were they not?
That's exactly right. Yeah, they're part of the circus act.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you lump together 10 or 20 groups or nonprofits or even congregations in the same church, you find these collaborative opportunities, and I certainly invite you to share any more that you have. Your background is Christian, of course, Graham, and of course, in Canada we have a lot of conversations about the Muslim faiths and of course Indigenous faiths, of which there are many. I don't mean to put you on the spot because I don't know if you've gone there yet, but have you had any conversations or opportunities to sort of meld any of these three groups into a common space?
We have in fact, we had a wonderful experience over the past couple of months with groups that have not been able to meet in some of the community halls and cinemas that they normally meet in because of the pandemic, and because we've been able to stay open for let's call them live broadcast type of events for faith communities. We've opened our doors particularly, and in fact pretty excited to have a Jewish community that came in first for a bar mitzvah, very, very socially distanced, very careful, etc. And then they've come back and said, would you be open to us holding some regular prayer meetings and gatherings, religious gatherings here? In the case of that site that's involved with the Anglican Church, we went to the bishop and said, Bishop, what do you think about this? And the bishop's open, and we're in the middle of that conversation to open the doors there. Another example are the Unitarians, again, this is a fairly public story, so I can share it. With the Unitarians, for some of you may be confused between the United Church of Canada and Unitarian. Unitarians are not. It's not a Christian religion. It's a kind of multi-faith approach, quite common around Canada, wonderful people. And they approached us because they were looking for a new building in Toronto. We're helping them with that. But then they found that they were looking at a site that was very near one of their other congregations. And so they said, hey, you were involved with church planting, Graham. How did church planting groups deal with treading on each other's toes? And I thought this was amazing. So we sat down with the board for the Unitarians, and I shared with them how it works for Christian church planting groups. We've had Muslim groups who talk, I'll tell you the big one, Paul, with Muslim groups is the amount of local tax they pay. So if they take over, for instance, a school and begin using that as a mosque community, they don't always get a tax exemption as a place of worship, which is a societal injustice in Canada, that most Christian groups, even if nobody turns up, get a tax break on their building. Many Muslim communities that take on newer sites don't always benefit from that. And one of our neighboring mosques in Montreal, they're paying over $100,000 a year in local tax for a building that's much smaller than ours, this one, but that does not pay any tax. So, there are all kinds of justice issues there. And we are trying to say, and one of the most, here's a fun fact. Cineplex Odeon, they're non-film business in Canada. Right, so everything Cineplex does other than showing films, the big chunk of that is renting to churches, right? Those churches that rent cinemas are doing incredibly well, right? Now, there's lots of places in Alberta where this is not the case. I'm talking about across all of Canada. My point is, churches in rented facilities do just fine. Pre-COVID, COVID's had a whole other thing on it. But as soon as you get used to renting your church space, and then an hour later, there's a horror movie happening in the same cinema, well, does that prepare you for somebody else in your same space is preaching a completely different message about God? And of course, many Christians feel that way about other types of Christians. Think, I don't want those kind of Christians in my. So I don't think we're not seeking after doing multi-faith just for its own sake, just to be cool, and say, hey, look, federal government, we're doing multi-faith stuff. I think we've made that case with the federal government fairly successfully. But it's going to happen. And I think the average Canadian wants to see that kind of peacemaking happen. And if we could really help faith communities understand this, I think the average Canadian might even be more open to a specific faith claim when they see that faith group living with an open hand towards other faith groups. That's not a watering down of those groups. It's showing that they are confident enough in their beliefs that they're able to live beside each other.
Those are encouraging stories, Graham. And I mean, let's face it, even within the Christian communities, there's a lot of issues that separate, on separation and divorce, on pro-choice, on female ministers. I mean, these are the issues that divide just within the Christian community.
That's right.
So going beyond that, I liked your earlier rule about no nudity and evil. And,
Yeah.
And yes, I could understand, a congregation not wanting weapons to be assembled in their church, or a strip club taking up residence. I can see that happening. But what are some other examples of matching up and pairing that you've found interesting?
I mean, let me. I think there are some natural, getting churches together with refugee groups, what a natural connection, right? That's easy. Where we found, I'll give you one funny example, was when we had a student ministry group that meets on campus, and then they decided to meet with 4 of the universities on campus at the same time. But we had already promised to the Department of Urban Planning of the City of Montreal that they could run an event launching their vision for the green back alleys of the downtown Montreal. So there were 100 very serious urbanists in this main sanctuary. And then all these student, kind of happy clappy students in the hall. So we'd said to the students, would you mind please not using amplified music for your night that night? And that was a good way of, helping the sound issues. What we hadn't realized is they'd invited these other 3 groups. So there were actually 300 students singing in the room next door. So amplified music or no amplified music, these urbanists are hearing these 300 students singing about Jesus at the top of their lungs. And we didn't mean to lord that over, we didn't mean to do that exactly, but it was a happy, it was fun. And we were able to explain to them what had happened. Other types of times where maybe it was a bit less happy, I mentioned the homeless shelter. I think that we've seen an unfortunate situation where I think there's a hot potato in cities, especially, and rural areas as well, of reaching the most vulnerable, where the work amongst the most vulnerable is not properly costed. And particularly with space, a lot of that gets put onto churches that are on their last legs. And it's something that I really don't like seeing, where the hardest to do work in the city gets dumped on the church that has literally not a leg left to stand on. And the reason I particularly don't like it is it's very good. Forms very good conditions for private developers who don't mean to be as destructive as they sometimes are. They're very constructive as well. Wonderful developers in every city in Canada. But there's times where a developer will come along and a church that's really down at, and of course there's no middle ground available. The building gets bought, the demolition order gets put in, the city is saying, how did this happen? And so I think work that's not properly costed is back to that, telling the truth, getting it out there, and churches need to do better with their budgets. And there are times where I love talking, Paul, as you know, I love talking about ideas, but there are a lot of times where honestly, we have to stop with the talking about ideas and get out the spreadsheets. run the figures. Right? So there we go.
And to
So
agree.
yeah, there's a few other questions in here. So somebody coming from Saskatchewan, an Orthodox Church. That's
Yeah,
very
someone's
nice. Thank you.
noted in from Saskatchewan, is mostly expressing appreciation for what you had to
Yeah,
offer.
that's very kind.
One individual has asked about shared spaces. Does this impact Christian worship and the faith of that community?
Yeah, so let me just say a little bit more about this. The doctoral work that I've been doing, and I've been moving it over from a seminary into it's actually going to be rooted in one of the business schools here in Montreal. So that's been an interesting shift for me in my doctoral research, and that back little nod to the the power of spreadsheets and some of this stuff. The theological work around that Christian worship, I mean, there is an assumption that a lot of Western Christians have that if you really love God and you really follow God well, you will do that out of a very holy space. This is actually, let's just focus on Christianity for a minute, rather than try to make sweeping statements about Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and the Sikh faith. But certainly within the Christian faith, I think we've really misunderstood sacred space. It really doesn't take long to go back to the person of Jesus and find that this guy hung around a temple. The temple was not only a religious facility, it also was a market, not only an unholy market. You know, Jesus turns over the tables and says, "Get out of my father's, get out of my father's house. Den of, will not be the den of robbers." Actually, the temple was a very multifaceted kind of place, and Jesus was making a point not so much about selling in the marketplace, but about having to pay to access God. Was his complaint. So in the case of holy space, I think we have too high of a view of sacred space. And one of our bishops in the Anglican Church, he will make this point. He has made this point, Bishop Rick Thorpe. He said, actually, what it also reveals is our too low of a view of making space sacred by our presence. And let's just do this in a slightly more secular way. If somebody believes that they are a peacemaker, and I believe everybody on our call today should qualify themselves as a peacemaker, in fact, they bring that peace with them to the place where they go. And I would say they make that ground holy. They make the Zoom meeting holy. You know, they say this is a place where we intend on making peace. And it doesn't have to be in a physical place. Isn't that one of the big lessons of the pandemic? Yes, there are holy spaces. Yes, we appreciate their history. And yes, there's a future for them. Yes, we believe the future is a much more, open them to more groups and they'll be, even more available. But I think Christian worship actually works much better when we slay the dragon or burn or remove the false idol of our space. Here is a test, right? If something is a false idol, and again, we could use a secular version. Somebody's, this become a kind of sacred cow, right? And we say, how do you remove the sacred cow? Well, as soon as you fast from it, you say, well, look, I think this thing might be controlling me. Let me just stop my need for that for a little while. I was going to make a joke about gin and tonic being an essential part of Anglican conflict resolution, but of course, there's many ways that can go wrong too. But I do like a little gin and tonic every once in a while.
So do the Catholics, Graham.
So do the Catholics, and I know there are some evangelicals in Alberta that have a little gin and tonic as well. I've seen some clandestine gin and tonics here and there as well. So, but my point is, I think Christian worship will come into an entirely new phase during these days. Some of the giant churches that we have will do really well because they're really good at it. Others will change, and we're going to see some huge change. And I think it's going to be incredibly positive. And people who are would not normally consider themselves spiritual people, I think are seeking after a spirituality through this pandemic in a way I've never seen before.
That is a great note, I think, Graham, to start to wind down our talk today. I know it resonates for me. My military experience, what did we take pride in? We took pride in bringing order where there was chaos. And I know our community here today, gathered today, takes pride in the fact that they can be a calming influence and bring real conversation, real understanding, and process to dispute resolution. So I think it's really important. And regardless of what faith community you're looking at, is it really the building you're in? Is it, or is it the land, as the indigenous people would hold forward? Is it a mountaintop? Is it that hike out in the fresh air? We all find that calm and that peace in different places, and it's not necessarily associated with the structure itself. And my hat is off to you, and I know you must be enjoying the work that you're doing, salvaging
Absolutely.
these churches. I will give the last word to you. Key message, a message perhaps that you want to provide that will give those that are fascinated by urban architecture and historic churches, or concerned about their own faith community. I'll leave you that last message.
Thank you.
Before I do that, I'll of course thank you. I want to really express our appreciation for spending time with us today. Just a reminder to those attending that we look forward to our future webinars, and please, send us suggestions and speakers perhaps that you've heard from before that you'd like to hear in this forum or in a conflict resolution discussion. There are a number of past presentations that are up on the ADR Alberta Luncheon website. You can view that. And in fact, you can take a look at an earlier presentation from Graham. It is posted there. It's a slightly different subject, more about the fundamental work of the TCF, but you can take a look at that as well. But there's a lot of other great content there as well. So my thanks to the participants for being here today and for registering. My thanks to you, Graham, and I will turn over the last word to you as we say farewell.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you again for everyone for your kind and insightful comments I've been enjoying on the chat. It really has, I think for those of us who love Canada, which I imagine is all of us, I think just those little moments to connect Alberta and Quebec are always beautiful. So thank you for that opportunity. There's somebody who has asked, I'll say this by way of last word, with how inclusive can a leader be? And they particularly asked about church leaders. Well, I don't think there's any limit. And I don't think it stops the specificity of the things that we also want to say by being inclusive and embracing others. Jesus certainly was a master dispute resolution professional and has a very good example. And I think actually as we open our eyes to other faith traditions and in fact other worldviews, maybe the worldview as an urbanist, we realize that we have a heck of a lot to learn from each other. And my very last word to all of you, whether you're a person of faith or not, I have the privilege of saying to you from my faith perspective, blessed are the peacemakers. That's you. So be blessed. Have a wonderful day. Thanks again for the privilege, Paul.
Thank you again, Graham. Visit the FOAJ and the ADRIA website, sign up for free newsletters, and we look forward to greeting many of you back here for our February luncheon as soon as that's announced. So goodbye, everybody, and thanks again for being here.